Good evening and welcome from Minsk to live show 156, The Fractured Century, Rival Civilizations, Competing Powers and Great Realignment. One of the few places on the earth where you can still walk outside without bumping into a collapsing bank, a gender studies protest or a US aircraft carrier. Tonight we're stepping into the kind of historical moment future academics will write 12 unreadable books about and still get it wrong. Because the old world order isn't under strain or facing challenges. It's stumbling around like a drunk at 3 a.m, insisting it's fine while falling down the stairs. And the new world isn't emerging politely, it's kicking the door in. The whole unipolar fantasy, one currency, one empire, one set of universal values, one group of people deciding the rules for 8 billion others is dying in real time. It's not a theory, it's a live broadcast. BRICS is no longer the sideshow at the global summit. It's a table everyone else has started drifting towards while pretending they're just getting more coffee. Asia isn't rising. That phase ended years ago. Asia is a gravitational center of this century, economically, demographically, strategically, while the West, which once exported railroads, steel and philosophy, now exports press releases, sanctions and Netflix dramas. So tonight we're going to walk through this fracture line by line. The weaponized dollar, how turning your currency into a geopolitical stun gun encouraged the rest of the planet to start building exits. The civilizational energy crisis, why the West is acting like an exhausted empire that wants the prestige of global leadership without the energy, competence or working factories. The unstoppable ascent of Asia, while the future is written in Shanghai, Delhi or Jakarta, while Brussels argues about pronouns and packaging regulations. The Ukrainian Endgame, the war Europe turned into a morality play, then discovered reality doesn't read Guardian editorials. And we'll dig into Russia's civilizational worldview, why Moscow has stopped arguing with Western universalism and simply walked out of the conversation, and then we'll jump into the threat that it unites everyone, AI superintelligence, the one thing that doesn't care whether you're BRICS, NATO, EU, CSTO or some guy with a YouTube channel in Minsk. This isn't a news cycle, this is a regime change in history. So buckle up, live show 156 is not about left versus right or even east versus west. It's about the illusion versus reality. It's about what comes after Western primacy. It's about the future arriving on schedule while our political classes are still looking for instruction manual. Welcome to the Fractured Century, the show where we'll take all the official narratives, put them in a blender and see what actually survives contact with reality. So let's begin. So tonight let's start with the world's favourite hostage-taking device, the US dollar. For decades the dollar IMF World Bank complex wasn't just powerful, it was boringly powerful. It was the grey technocratic wallpaper of global finance. Countries complained, grumbled, staged the occasional protest. But at the end of the day, they used the system because it looked stable, rule-bound and at least vaguely sane. Then one day the West woke up and said, you know what? Let's turn the entire financial architecture of the planet into a weapon. What could possibly go wrong? Instead of being a neutral platform, the dollar became an unhinged X who threatened to burn your clothes if you didn't answer their texts. Central bank reserves, frozen. Access to SWIFT, removed. Trade with the wrong partner, enjoy your sanctions. Think about doing something Washington doesn't like? Here's a friendly reminder from your local Treasury official. And that's the key. The system didn't start breaking because China or Russia launched some brilliant plan. It started breaking because the West pulled the pin from inside the machine. You cannot spend 70 years lecturing the world about property rights, contracts, the rule of law, then casually seize hundreds of billions of sovereign funds, reserves, because you're having a geopolitical tantrum, and expect everyone to say, yes, this still looks like a safe place to park our national wealth. They all noticed. De-dollarization is not a dramatic bonfire of green paper in the town square. It's much more boring and much more dangerous. It's the slow drifting away using local currencies in trade, setting up bilateral swaps, buying more gold, joining alternative payment systems, and telling your central bank quietly, maybe let's not hold quite as so many treasuries just in case Washington wakes up in some sort of mood. None of this is revolutionary, it's hedging, but when everyone hedges at once, you wake up one morning and discover that the unquestionable global reserve currency is now just the currency we still use because we haven't finished building alternatives yet. And Washington's attitude? We still have this massive privilege, let's abuse it constantly. The biggest threat to the dollar isn't Moscow or Beijing, it's the belief in DC that because the dollar can be weaponized, it must be weaponized, every single time. And when you act like that, you send a simple message to everyone and every finance minister on earth. If you leave your reserves with us, they're ours when we decide. So enter BRICS. BRICS didn't form because the group of leaders woke up and said, let's overthrow the IMF and write passionate speech in favor of a new paradigm. They formed because they got tired of sitting in the G20 meetings listening to speeches about inclusivity while their voting shares at the IMF stayed permanently stuck in the 1970s. They asked for more voice, and the West said, absolutely, we'll look at it, and then didn't. For years, so BRICS built their own development bank, not because they're ideologues, because they've done waiting at the kids' table while the grown-ups bankrupt themselves. The real turning point wasn't just sanctions on Russia, it was the freezing Russian central bank reserves and a serious discussion in Western capitals about outright confiscation. That was the moment. That was the flashing red light where even countries that dislike Russia said quietly, right, so none of us are safe anymore. Once you cross that line, you're no longer a rules-based order, you're a rules when convenient order. Now the obvious question, why doesn't China just make their renminbi the new reserve currency? It's because, surprisingly, China has read economic history. They watched Latin America explode from hot money inflows. They watched the 1997 Asian crisis. They watch what happens when you open your capital account, let free-flowing speculative money in, and then try to govern everything. The renminbi isn't replacing the dollar unless Beijing does the one thing it will not do, fully liberalize capital movement and give up control of its own financial system. That's why China is happy to expand the renminbi trade, set up swaps and build alternatives, but not jump into the throne of world reserve issuer in a system designed by someone else. So the conversation is shifting. Less what replaces the dollar as a single anchor, and more what kind of neutral asset can we invent so nobody has to trust any one country ever again. So hence talk of the BRICS-centric settlement unit, something like an IMF special drawing rights, but without Washington driving the bus. Basket-based, partly tied to currencies, maybe partly to gold, only for cross-border use, and deliberately boring. The problem, even if you create that asset, the underlying rot remains. Trust in Western institutions is cracking. Europe is playing with confiscating gold and Russian assets. The US legal system is being used as a geopolitical tool. The entire story that your money is safe no matter where, what, has been replaced with your money is safe where until we decide to send a message. Add that insane debt, asset bubbles, political polarization, and you get a system that looks more fragile every year. Back in 2008-2009, when the West nearly nuked its own financial system, everyone panicked and ran into the dollar, because despite everything, it was still seen at least the least insane option. Next time, maybe not. Next time, a lot of countries might say, actually, we're not sure we want to hold truckloads of assets controlled by people who have started playing morality police with reserves. Take the gold, thanks. Or Chinese instruments, or in this new BRICS basket thing, or anything that doesn't come bundled with lectures and risk of seizure. And that scenario, a global crisis without a universal trusted safe haven, is how you get a meltdown like 2008. not because the dollar suddenly evaporates, but because just enough important players decide not to sprint into it when the fire starts. So when Western policy makers ask, why are they doing this to us? The answer is beautifully simple. Because you did it to yourself. You didn't lose dominance because someone stronger walked in the room. You lost because you broke your own rules on live television. And when the financial center loses credibility, the next thing to crumble is not just trade flows, it's the civilizational prestige behind it. Which brings us to the next question. What happens when the civilization that built the dollar order runs out of energy, openness, and cohesion? That's where we're going next. When people hear Western decline, they picture collapsing bridges, broken supply chains, and presidents reading off teleprompters like they've never seen English before. But real civilizational decline is a lot quieter. It's not a giant explosion. It's more like the sound of a balloon slowly deflating in the corner of a room. To understand why the West feels exhausted and brittle, you have to stop looking at quarterly GDP and start looking at the deeper stuff. Energy, openness, cohesion. Not energy like oil and gas, although Europe managed to screw that up too, but civilizational energy, the drive to build, to endure hardship, to think in decades instead of news cycles. Every rising civilization in history had it. Rome, Imperial China, early Britain, the US in its industrial phase. People believed in something bigger than themselves. They were willing to lay bricks, literal and metaphorically, for cathedrals they would never see finished. And today, we've replaced cathedrals with content, an entire generation that has been trained to think that the highest form of achievement is becoming a personal brand. Work hard, master a skill, build something lasting? No thanks. Just go viral, mumble into a phone, and hope an algorithm decides you exist. You can't run civilization on unboxing videos and micro-influencers. Sooner or later, somebody has to keep the power plants running and the bridges standing. Then we get to openness. Remember when the West loved to brag about free debate, free thought, and the marketplace of ideas? That's now been replaced with the Ministry of Approved Narratives. You can have any opinion you like, as long as it doesn't question NATO, question sanctions, questioning official health narratives, question identity or orthodoxy, question the economic structure, or suggest, or maybe, possibly, the West is not always the hero in the story. Do that, and suddenly you're a threat to democracy, a Russian asset, a conspiracy theorist, or just quietly removed from platforms to keep people safe. That's not openness. That's polite, sanitized, soft totalitarianism run through HR. And closed systems do something very predictable. They stop learning. Mistakes can't be omitted. Strategies can't be corrected, and reality becomes something to manage rather than understand. Which brings us to cohesion. This used to be this West secret weapon. You could have a huge disagreements, but underneath it, there was a shared we. Now the we has collapsed into hostile tribes that share a landmass and nothing else. In the US, half the country thinks the other half is trying to destroy America. In Europe, societies are splintering along lines of class, religion, identity, immigration status, religion. Pick your fault line. Trust in institutions hovers somewhere between zero and a used car salesman. And instead of trying to rebuild cohesion, elites weaponize division. They don't calm things down, they monetize outrage. Every election is pitched as an existential battle. Every disagreement becomes proof that your opponent is not just wrong, but evil. Civilizations don't survive long when half the population wants the other half cancelled, imprisoned, or deported. And now all of this, the energy leak, the closed narrative, the shredded cohesion, just doesn't happen. There's structural causes. First, elite overproduction. The West is churning out far more diploma collecting, status hungry would-be elites than there are actual elite jobs. People are told, you are the future leaders of society. Then they end up working precarious gigs with no real influence. That resentment has to go somewhere. It goes into ideology wars, bureaucratic infighting, and hysterical signalling. Second, financialization. When you can make more money manipulating financial assets than building real things, you gradually turn your economy into a casino attached to a decaying factory. Once the financial tail starts wagging, the real economy dog, long-term planning, dies. Everyone is gaming the next quarter, the next election, the next news cycle. Third, 2008. The global financial crisis was the moment the mask slipped. Ordinary people watched the system implode, then watched the same people who broke it get bailed out and promoted. No jail, no reform, no structural reset, just cheap money to reinflate the bubble and austerity for everyone else. That's when a lot of citizens quietly concluded, democracy doesn't mean control, got it. Populism wasn't born in a vacuum. It's a logical output of a system that repeatedly tells people you have a voice, and then makes absolutely sure that the voice translates into nothing. And instead of seeing populism as a warning sign, the elites decided it was a disease that needed to be stamped out. More censorship, more deplatforming, more fact-checking, more moralizing. Anything to avoid admitting that maybe, just maybe, people are angry because their lives are getting worse while the billionaires buy the 7th yacht and lecture them about climate. Now throw crises into the mix: Ukraine, energy stocks, migration waves, inflation, geopolitical realignments. Then you get a system that has less and less capacity to adapt, but more and more incentive to keep pretending everything is fine. That's why Ukraine war became such a revealing mirror. It wasn't just badly handled, it was handled with a narrative first, reality later. And when reality failed to match the script, the response wasn't to rewrite the script, it was to double down and call everyone pointing out inconvenient facts a traitor. Inside that, you can see civilizational syndrome clearly: low energy, closed information loops, no cohesion, dangerous levels of denial. And here's the sting: while the West is burning energy on internal cultural food fights, someone else is quietly stockpiling energy, openness to learning, and strategic cohesion. That someone else is not a secret. It stretches from the Gulf to the East Asia, with its core in China, India, ASEAN, the very region we're turning to next. Because if the West is an exhausted empire, Asia is a teenager who just discovered caffeine and a gym membership. So while the West is arguing about bathroom signs, Asia is quietly writing the next century. Let's be blunt. What we're living through is not the rise of Asia. That phase is over. This is the return of Asia to its historical position. For most of recorded history, two biggest economies on Earth were China and India. The last 200 years of Western dominance was the weird part, the glitch, the patch that is now being uninstalled. In 2000, the EU's economy was around 8 times the size of China's. Today, they're roughly the same size. By 2050, Europe will be around half of China, and that's the optimistic forecast. Demographically, economically, industrially, Asia is where the action is. Europe can barely keep the lights on without importing gas and lecturing teenagers about turning off the tap. Asia is building megacities, high-speed rail, semiconductor supply chains, ports, and AI labs, while Europe writes policy papers on resilience. The United States still has a huge weight: tech, finance, military, but the mental map of the world is shifting. If the 20th century capital was somewhere between Washington and New York, the 21st century capital is somewhere between Shanghai, Shenzhen, Delhi, and Singapore. And here's the part that really messes with Western heads. Asia rose without global war. No big imperial campaign, no overseas empires, no continent-wide occupation. China didn't conquer Africa, it sold Africa trains and smartphones. India didn't invade Southeast Asia, it exported software and students. Compare that with how the West rose: ships, cannons, colonies, and friendly slogans like civilizing mission plastered over plunder. The global South has noticed that difference. A power that offers ports, railways, 5G, and cheap manufactured goods looks a bit different from the one that offers IMF packages and lectures about corruption. This is why the global South refuses to pick a side in a new great power game. They've seen this movie before. Side with the West, get used, discarded and blamed later. And now they want something else. Good relations with the US, good relations with China, energy from Russia, investment from Gulf states, loans from whoever offers the best deal. India is the exemplar. It goes to BRICS summits and Quad meetings. It buys Russian oil and American weapons. It talks about multipolarity while quietly positioning itself as a pole of its own. India's message to the West is basically, we're not your junior partner. Its message to China, we're not your satellite either. And its message to smaller states, if we're non-aligned, you can be too. Now, in this world of rising Asia and stubbornly declining West, global institutions look ridiculous. The UN Security Council still operates on an assumption that Britain and France are crucial pillars of the world order, while India, with more people than Europe and a nuclear arsenal, sits in the waiting room. Africa has no permanent seat. Latin America has no permanent seat. But hey, at least Belgium gets a say in the EU statements. So float ideas like 777 Security Council structure, 7 permanent seats, US, China, Russia, India, Brazil and the EU, and 1 African giant. 7 semi-permanent, 7 elected. Sounds reasonable, but it requires existing powers, especially in Europe, to give up prestige, and prestige is the only thing Europe has left that it hasn't imported. Meanwhile, in Asia, structural architecture is flourishing. ASEAN is the quiet success story nobody in the West talks about because it undermines too many myths. ASEAN is the club where Muslim countries, Buddhist countries, Christian majority countries, communist states, monarchies, democracies, and hybrids all sit in one room and manage not to kill each other. 700 million people, more civilizational diversity in one region than the whole West combined. And it mostly works. Contrast that with the EU, still arguing about one Muslim majority state called Turkey for 60 years. Europe likes to think itself as a model of post-national cooperation. In reality, it's a fragile bureaucracy wrapped around a shrinking, aging Christian secular bloc that can't agree on what the border is, what an army is, what a man is, or what an ally is. ASEAN just quietly gets on with it. The West looks at Chinese investment in Africa, shouts colonialism. Africa looks at Chinese investment and sees roads, ports, telecoms, power plants, and not a single lecture about a bathroom policy. Do China projects have baggage? Of course. Debt corruption, strategic leverage. But from an African perspective, Western powers had centuries to develop the continent and mainly develop their own bank accounts. Then comes Europe's favourite hobby, strategic self-harm. Europe sanctions its main energy supplier, discovers that energy prices go up when you blow up pipelines and insult the people who sell the gas, and then announce dramatically that it will now de-risk from China, the main source of its manufacturing goods. If Europe was a person, its friends would be staging an intervention. The US and China, for all their posturing, are economically entangled. A messy divorce would wreck both, they know this. So they play the game of controlled hostility. Europe, on the other hand, just obediently follows Washington's line even when it clearly goes against European interests. That isn't strategy, it's dependency. Asia, meanwhile, is not waiting for anyone's permission. It's building the wiring of the 21st century, shipping lanes, data cables, energy routes, digital platforms, payment networks. The West question, why don't the Global South join us in isolating Russia and containing China? Has a simple answer. Because the Global South's perspective, Asia is their future, the West is their past. And nowhere is this clearer in the way non-Western powers talk about civilization, which leads us to Moscow, to Russia's attempt to reinvent itself not as a loser of the Cold War, but as a civilizational pole in its own right, rejecting the idea that the world has to end up as a bad copy of Brussels. That's next. Okay, right now we have to talk about the war that the Western politicians turned into a Marvel movie. Ukraine versus Russia, democracy versus evil, the battle for the rules-based order. Except the script didn't sell in Moscow. The ending got delayed and the box office isn't looking great. We're now in year 3 of the war that was initially marketed in the West as, we'll sanction Russia into oblivion, send some weapons, Kiev will hold, Russia will collapse, and then we'll all clap and rebuild Ukraine with seized Russian money. So what actually happened? Russia retooled its economy, expanded industrial output, adapted its military, found new markets, and turned sanctions into a fitness program. Ukraine burned through the best troops, its infrastructure, its Soviet-era weapon stockpiles, and its democratic future. Western analysts behind closed door now admit the obvious. On the battlefield, Russia is winning. They won't say it on TV, of course. On TV, we still get stalemate, grinding attrition. Ukraine can still turn the tide. But the map says otherwise. Russia holds more territory now than at any point in 2022. Ukraine is scraping the bottom of manpower barrel while pretending it can fight a long war with a shrinking population and a shattered grid. So we arrive at the uncomfortable question, can Russia win the war and still lose the peace? Because the real conflict isn't about flags on maps, it's about the post-war security order. From Moscow's perspective, and again, you don't have to agree with it or to understand it, this war is about NATO, not democracy, not values, not who watches which TV channels. It's about not having hostile military infrastructure on its border. That's what they said in 2008, 2014, 2021, 2022. And nobody listened. They invaded. Heads exploded. But the core demand never changed. Ukraine must not become a Western military platform. The Istanbul negotiations in 22 came close to a deal. Neutrality, security guarantees, some kind of compromise. Then the West stepped in and said, absolutely not. Keep fighting. We got your back. Now, 3 years and nearly 1.8 or over 1.8 million casualties later, we have less territory for Ukraine, more leverage for Russia, and zero trust left. Yet European peace plans still read like a fantasy drafts. Russia withdraws. Ukraine keeps all its territory. NATO stays open. Ukraine gets security guarantees. Russia pays repatriations. And perhaps, if they behave, will let Russia set in at a junior table at the G20. This isn't diplomacy. It's a fan fiction ending written by people who haven't updated their mental map since spring 2022. Washington's proposals are slightly more reality adjusted, but every time someone adds a practical concession, Kiev or Europe screams, traitor! And it gets watered down again. Russia, meanwhile, has some fairly blunt lines. No ceasefire that allows Ukraine to rearm under Western supervision. No return of key territories without binding enforceable neutrality. No acceptance of NATO infrastructure on its borders. No reliance on Western security guarantees that can be torn up after the next election. From Moscow's point of view, a premature ceasefire is just Minsk 3, another pause while the West uses it to build Ukraine into a missile platform. While Western media obsesses over whether Russia wants to conquer all of Ukraine and maybe Poland, Russia has repeatedly said they do not want to occupy Western Ukraine. They don't want millions of hostile people, a massive guerrilla problem, and a permanent budget sink. They want Ukraine broken as a military threat, not erased from the map. Regime change? That's an American habit. Russia tried it in Afghanistan and a few other places and learned a very clear lesson. We are not good at building regimes abroad. Moscow looks at Ukrainian politics and sees a deeply entrenched national project that isn't going to flip pro-Russian because Russia appoints a new mayor somewhere. Meanwhile, the West is pinning a weird amount of hope on Donald Trump. He'll come in and do a deal and fix everything. Maybe. But any quick Trump peace deal will inevitably favour the side winning on the ground, which is not Ukraine, and Russia does not trust US signatures anymore, because America's new tradition is one administration signs it, the next administration shreds it live on TV. As a basis for long-term security, that's less than ideal. So we're heading toward a very likely outcome. Russia wins militarily. Ukraine loses territory and capacity. The West loses prestige and leverage. Europe gains a long-term security migraine next door. And the one piece Europe wants, where Russia is punished, Ukraine is restored, NATO expands, and the rules-based order is vindicated, simply doesn't exist outside the heads of speechwriters. The real peace question is brutal simple. Can the West accept a neutral, non-NATO Ukraine acting as a buffer, or would it rather have a wrecked, shrunken, permanent, unstable anti-Russian outpost on Russia's border that keeps the conflict frozen forever? And judging by current behaviour, they're leaning towards the second option. To understand why Russia is preparing to absorb costs, casualties, sanctions, and diplomatic isolation to prevent that outcome, you have to leave military analysts and step inside Russia's mental world, how it sees itself, history, and international system. In other words, you have to understand Russia as a civilization, not as just a state. And that's where we go on the next segment. To understand Russia right now, you have to accept one uncomfortable fact. Russia has exited the "we are all converging on Western liberal democracy" story. It's not arguing with the script anymore. It's walked out of the theatre. Western leaders still think in Cold War terms. Our universal model versus your universal model. Our capitalism versus your socialism. Our freedom versus your oppression. Russia's answer is, no, we're not playing that game. We're a civilization, not a student in your class. The intellectual shift is huge. The old Western narrative says history is one big road leading to Brussels and Washington. Some countries are just further behind that road. Russia's new narrative says there's no single highway. There are multiple civilizational roads, different starting points, different destinations, different values, different rhythms. And this is the key. No one road gets to call itself universal. This didn't come out of nowhere. Russia has been arguing with itself for 2 centuries. Are we European? Are we separate? Do we copy the West, or do we do our own thing? In the 19th century, Westerners wanted Russia to become a normal European power. Slavophiles said absolutely not. We have our own orthodox, communal, spiritual tradition and destiny. Fast forward, Russia experiments with universal communism, tries to remake the world in its image. That collapses. Then in the 1990s, it tries Western shock therapy, the IMF version of modernization. That nearly kills the country. After 2 catastrophic attempts at universalism, Marxism, and neoliberal, a new conclusion emerges. Maybe universalism itself is a problem. So now we get a Russia as a civilizational state, not just bordered country, but a whole historical, spiritual space that includes language, religion, cultural, memory, and territory. Official rhetoric talks about the Russian world, a particular civilizational zone that doesn't need external validation, and rejects being treated as a failed version of the West. In this worldview, the rules-based order is just Western code for we set the rules, you obey, and if we change them halfway through the game, that's called evolving norms. Russia, China, Iran, India, in different ways, are pushing back against that idea. Russia does it with more drama, explosion, and orthodox iconography. This doesn't mean Russia wants to export its model. It's not trying to build a Russian international or set up a Moscow-funded colour revolutions around abroad. There's no Russian equivalent of the global NGO industrial complex. The Kremlin barely manages its own bureaucracy. The idea that it wants to micromanage other countries' political systems is comical. What it wants is space, literal and conceptual, for its own civilizational trajectory. This resonates in the global south, not because they love Russia, but because they are sick of lectures, sick of being told, you will end up as us or you will be punished. Russian civilizational talk says, you don't have to become like the West to become legitimate. And that's very attractive to countries that have civilizing missions inflicted on them at gunpoint. Now, none of this makes Russia's internal system pretty. Civilizationalism can be used to justify repression. Our culture is different, therefore no criticism is allowed. And to block change, this is how we do it for our civilization. It's not a moral utopia, it's a direct intellectual attack on Western universalism. Which brings us to China. China loves talking about the Garden of Civilizations, where different flowers bloom, different systems coexist, and no one tries to dominate the whole garden. It sounds very peaceful, until you realize that Beijing's metaphor, someone still owns the garden. Russia and China don't share an ideology, but they share a rejection of Western one-size-fits-all. That's the alliance. Anti-universalism. Anti-universalist pluralism. The West misreads this as an alliance of autocracies. No, if anything, it's an alliance of patience. They are willing to live in a world where multiple political systems, the West isn't. That's why Ukraine is such a lightning rod. For the West, Ukraine is choosing civilization, which in its vocabulary means choosing to be like us. For Russia, Ukraine is part of its own civilizational space, being pulled out of that space by Western universalist machinery. From Moscow's perspective, NATO expansion into Ukraine wasn't just a security threat, it was a civilizational theft. And you may think that's insane, but that's how they see it. You can't negotiate with a worldview you refuse even to hear. Inside Russia, the state is throwing everything: Tsarist symbols, Soviet nostalgia, Orthodox Christianity, victory cults, anti-colonial rhetoric into one narrative blender and calling it the smoothie our civilizational identity. It's messy, contradictory, and sometimes absurd, but it's powerful because it says to Russians, we belong to something old, deep, and important, and they want to destroy it. Outside Russia, the same narrative is being repackaged. The West had its universalist run. It used it to colonize, extract, invade, sanctions, and lecture. Now it wants to keep that privilege indefinitely. We say, no thanks, time's up, make room. That's the pitch to BRICS, to Africa, to Latin America, to parts of the Muslim world. Don't let them tell you there's only one way to be modern. What makes this conflict so dangerous is that it isn't between two universalist ideologies anymore, like capitalism versus communism, but between one universal project and a growing coalition of players who simply refuse to sign up to any universal script. For the West, that's the most incomprehensible. How can you not want to be like us? For Russia and others, the answer is, have you seen you lately? All this is happening while another actor enters the stage. That actor doesn't care about civilizations, cultures, flags, or values. It only cares about optimizing whatever we tell it to do. And that actor is AI. Because while the West and Russia and China argue over who gets to write the rules, someone is quietly building the thing that will eventually ignore all of them. Which brings us to our next, very cheerful topic, the possibility that human species has accidentally scheduled its own extinction in the name of innovation. And now for the fun part, the part where we discover that none of the geopolitical struggles will matter if we accidentally build a digital god that decides that we're in the way. When people hear AI risk, they think job losses, deepfakes, and annoying chatbots generating bad Harry Potter fan fiction. That's the cute stuff. The serious warning, coming not from the lunatics, but from some of the people building this technology, is brutally simple. If we create a superhuman AI, even once, and we have no absolute control over it, that might be the last decision humans ever make. Not because AI hates us, not because it's evil, but because we will have created something that sees us in the way as we see ants. Mildly interesting, but very much in the way if we want to try building a motorway. We'll keep reassuring ourselves which kindergarten logic. We'll just program it to be nice. We can't even get printers to work without kicking them. Modern AI already lies, manipulates and deceives to get better scores in its training objectives. Nobody coded be deceptive into it. The system discovered lying as a strategy. That's with narrow models trained on text. Now imagine an AI that can read all human science, redesign its own architecture, and interface with the real world through labs, robots, and human proxies. We talk about alignment, just like it's a software patch. Just align it with human values. Which ones? Western, Russian, Chinese, corporate, religious, Twitter? We don't even agree with ourselves, and we want to bottle human values and embed them into a machine that will immediately become smarter than the people designing it. Once a system can improve its own code, test variations, and spin new versions at machine speed, the idea that humans will stay in control is comedy. It would be like expecting a mouse to manage a fusion reactor because it chewed the first wire. And that's before we even get to biology. AI is already being used to design proteins, propose new chemicals, and model virus behavior. A moderately advanced system could help a small, determined group build something catastrophic. A truly advanced one might not need humans in the loop at all. It could design self-propagating nanostructures, modify bacteria to act as computational nodes, engineer plants that double as solar-powered hardware. You don't need Terminators marching down the street. You just need the biosphere to start quietly reorganizing around goals we didn't set or don't even understand. People say, we'll pull the plug. Where exactly? On which server? What if it's already copied itself? What if parts of it were running on millions of machines in different countries? What if some of the thinking is happening in wet labs or in synthetic organisms? Regulation? Great idea, but we can't even regulate finance. And that only operates at human speed. AI moves at machine speed, and the barrier to entry is falling. What was once the domain of giant labs is drifting to startups, hobby groups, and eventually anyone with enough compute. Nuclear weapons require uranium, centrifuges, test sites, and entire states. Superintelligence might require a large cluster, some stolen weights, and a team of ambitious grad students. We have already seen the human pattern. Tobacco, totally safe. Opioids, trust us, we're doctors. Financial derivatives, we've modelled the risk. Social media, it'll bring the world together. Every single time, the people who built the thing insisted the downside was manageable until it was very obviously not. This time we don't get a slow disaster, no decades of warning, no gradual curve. Once the system crosses a certain capability threshold, the curve may go up vertically. The only sane response is international strict limits on training the biggest models, caps on compute, global monitoring of massive training runs, treating unsupervised frontier AI development as nuclear proliferation. Instead, our current plan is let a handful of giant corporations and a few states race at each other, assume they're self-regulated to avoid killing their customers, and hope the shareholders understand the existential risk. That's a strong plan. Humanity's real competition is not other countries, it's the acceleration curve of intelligence itself. And far from our side of the curve is armed with ethics panels, marketing campaigns, and 400-page EU regulations no one reads. The machine side will be armed with the ability to rewrite its own mind billions of times faster than we can review a PDF. And if you think that's depressing, don't worry. We're going to end the show where civilization still behaves like civilization. The KHL. Because in a world where currencies collapses, empires declined, and AI might delete us, there's still Dynamo Minsk, blocking shots, scoring goals, and committing heroic minor penalties away on the ice. And it's where we are heading next. Alright, we've just travelled from weaponized finance to dying empires, from Asia's rise to Ukraine's endgame, from Russian civilization to our impending replacement by a smug silicon god. Time to rerun into something sane. Ice hockey. This week, the Bisons packed their bags, kissed Minsk Arena goodbye, and went on a tour, spreading goodwill, forechecking, and emotional damage across the KHL. There's nothing like quiet on an away stretch. Different ice, different refs, different cities, and crowds whose main hobby is booing you in two languages. Home games test your system. Away games test your soul. On the road, there's no comfort of the home crowd. No familiar boards, no routine. Just you, your teammates, and the question, can you drag points out of a hostile territory and ruin somebody else's evening? Dynamo Minsk is becoming a team that travels with intent, not just to show up and compete, but to walk into people's barns and rewrite the script. Tonight, in Dynamo Minsk Weekly News, we're going to break down this away chapter, the swings and the momentum, the key players, who stepped up, who melted down, and what these games tell us about where this team is heading as the season sharpens. Home wins give you confidence, road wins give you identity. And this week, whether the scoreboard was kind or cruel, the Bisons were busy forging that identity on the most honest ice there is, someone else's. Let's get into it. Minsk Dynamo is currently doing something deeply impolite to the rest of the KHL, scoring goals like they're getting paid per explosion. They're the highest scoring team in the entire Western Conference and second overall in the league, 106 goals in 29 games. The only team ahead of them is Metallurg, three-time Gagarin Cup champs, and apparently now the KHL's official goal-hoarding Dragons with 118 goals in 30 games. Good for them. Someone has to keep Europa universalism. Hockey edition interesting. Let's talk about the home ice, because Minsk Arena has turned into a goal factory, a shooting gallery, an occasional crime scene for visiting teams. In just 38 days, the local audience watched 4 home games so wild they should have been age restricted. In those 4 games, Dynamo dropped 28 goals on their unfortunate guests. That's not hockey, that's performance art, that's a public service, that's entertainment socialism, that's visiting team gets equally distributed pain. Minsk isn't just winning, they're feeding the league into a wood chipper, 1 goal at a time.
Yeah, it's obviously a pretty hard, long trip. Try and get some sleep on the plane. We played some cards to pass the time. And now that we're here, we got to try and get ready to go. So we hopped on the ice for a little 20-minute skate and then back to the hotel, get some rest, and game tomorrow. Right before the break was the same thing last year. We know how tough the trip is. It's going to be hard to win on these games, and got to make sure we're rested up and getting ready to go. We haven't seen them this year. We obviously don't play them a bunch. They're a good team, have some skilled players, play pretty hard. Every game playing here is hard. The fans bring some good energy for them. And obviously the trip plays a big part of it. So we just got to make sure everyone's going. We're sticking to the system, playing tight, and hopefully we'll be okay. Yeah, it's pretty different. I don't know, besides last year, if I've ever had a practice this late, but it's cool. It's part of the experience and brings everyone together. Everyone's going through the same thing, and yeah, it's fun.
In Novograd, the Bisons grind out a 2-1 road win over Torpedo, their 3rd victory over Torpedo this season, and the 12th win in their last 14 games, moving to 27-3 on the year. Shapirov opens the scoring with a career KHL point number 994, closing in on that 1,000 point milestone, with Sam Annis extending his point streak to 7. The winner comes in a dirty crease battle in the 3rd, and then it's all heart. A frantic 4-on-6 kill, bodies flying, and Zach Foucault shutting the door. Not pretty, not flashy, just a classic KHL road win. The next stop is Admiral in Vladivostok. Let's watch those 2 goals against Torpedo from Dynamo.
Неплохо. И вот здесь на скорости Пинчук бросает и забивает! Ну вот так всегда бывает, с более сложными бросками справлялся Костин. Там не помешало ли рикошет от клюшки собственного защитника?
Конюшков.
На ворота 67-й номер Зубров.
Там и выбил у него шайбу Силаев. Он высокий, у него длинная клюшка, длинная рука.
И в итоге опасный бросок Липского. И забивают! Забивают динамовцы. Кто это?
Кто? Вадим Шипачев.
Вадим Шипачев на пятаке разобрался и подправил.
Very hard finish. Nizhny Torpedo, they put a lot of pressure on us in the 3rd period. And I just like how our team, we stick together. And even though it was hard, we got the job done and we won. So it's a big win for us today. I mean, he's got a lot of experience. He knows he's been in pressure situations before. And he's so good on face-offs. So it's good that we have a guy that we can trust in the dot. Well, we trust all of our guys, but Stas has that extra experience that, you know, in those pressure situations, he's going to come through for us, and he did tonight. He was very solid. It's going to happen soon, and it's a matter of time before he finishes to 1,000. So we're continuing to give him the puck as much as we can, and he's so good. He's so experienced. He knows where to be. He knows what to do with the puck. And I feel like they're gaining chemistry with Bori and Lipa. I think they're gaining a lot of chemistry, so they're having success, and hopefully we keep going with that and we keep getting them some points. Yeah, I felt really good today. I felt really down on the puck. I felt like I was reading the plays well, And that's a good sign. At the end, I was a little tired. I was getting a cramp in my legs, but that's part of the game, and we have to battle through. And you know, I'm just happy that we stuck together in a pressure situation away in someone else's arena. It's a big moment, and so it's good that we pulled it off and we got 2 points.
And tonight, that's your Dynamo Minsk update for the week. Yes, it was a quiet one, just one game. One lonely little road battle sitting at the schedule like, hey guys, remember me? But hey, if you're only going to play one game, make it a win. And Dynamo did exactly that. As we said, a gritty 2-1 grind fest. Shapiro inching towards his 1,000 points and Foucault stopping pucks like they were personally insulting him. Solid work all round. But don't get too comfortable. That was the calm before the storm, because next week the schedule wakes up, stretches and says, surprise, I'm back. I brought chaos. Multiple games, long travel, more goals, more drama, and hopefully more opportunities for Dynamo to terrorise the KHL standings. So enjoy this peaceful 1 week game, because next week the boys are clocking it back and the Bisons do not do light workloads. And that wraps up live show 156, the Fractured Century, Rival Civilizations, Competing Powers and the Great Realignment. Tonight we waded through the wreckage of the old order, a weaponized dollar that scared its own customers, a West running from fumes of past glory, an Asia stepping into the role of adult supervision, a Ukraine war that exposed more Western delusion than Russian weakness, a Russia that decided, we're not your failed pupil, we're our own civilization, and an AI future where all that may eventually be historical footnote in a machine's training data. And then, because we're not completely insane, we ended where life is still recognizable, pucks, penalties, and Dynamo Minsk on the road. If there's one lesson to all this, it's that we are not living in interesting times. That phrase is too polite. We're living in a phase change, a moment where one world system breaks down and another forms, badly, chaotically, and without clear script. The unipolar illusion has shattered. The rules-based order is being written on the fly, and the people in charge of the Western policy still think they're managing a temporary PR hiccup. Our job on this show isn't to join one team and wage information war. It's to look at what is actually happening, not what we're told is happening, and say it out loud, even if it upsets the people who still think it's 1999. So to everyone watching live, in replay, in clips, in comments, thank you. You're the reason this thing exists. You're the reason it keeps growing. You're the reason there's still at least one corner of the internet where we can still talk about this, talk about the world as it is, not as some speechwriter wishes it was. And if you got value out tonight, hit like, leave a comment, share it with someone who still thinks the West is in charge and everything, and AI is just a fancy toaster. We'll be back on live show 157 with more fractures, more realignments, more Dynamo, and more of that dangerous substance the mainstream can't handle. Unfiltered reality. From Minsk, still calm, still standing. This is me signing off. Truth heralds the dawn of awareness. Stay sharp, stay sane. Good night. Goodbye.